So the topic is Article 7 of the Energy Efficiency Directive, something that is probably not so much known outside of Europe, but it's a very hot topic in Europe right now. And just to set the scene of what we're actually discussing today, I need to switch to the next slide, and I'm not quite sure why this is. There we go. So this is in the more general discussion around the climate targets that we have in Europe, and the Energy Efficiency Directive is a key component to deliver energy efficiency and to ensure that Europe achieves the climate change targets that have been set, also in Paris more recently. And we will be showing you the results of 3 major research initiatives that have looked into what Article 7 has actually achieved, and what we think the key challenges are going forward to ensure that we reach the high ambitions of Article 7. So there's 3 big studies that have been produced by Tina and myself. The first one is a study of the ANSPOL project, which was looking at energy efficiency obligation schemes, also called white certificates or energy efficiency resource standards in the US. This is looking at all of the existing schemes in Europe in a lot of detail. The second study was for the European Parliament, looking at how member states have actually implemented the Energy Efficiency Directive in Article 7 and what the key challenges are. And the third study is a study that I led on behalf of the European Commission, looking at the plans of all the member states, analyzing those in detail. So all the slides that we be showing will be based in one way or another on those 3 major studies. And we put in references at the end of the presentation with a link. So for those of you who want to read more about this, if you're not bored to death by the end of this presentation, you can click on one of the links and you can get access to all of the information that you wish to look up. So what we're covering today is that we give you a very brief introduction into what actually Article 7 does, because we assumed when we designed the webinar that some of you will have heard about Article 7 already, and you will be familiar with it, but others will maybe not have come across it, and we wanted to give you a brief introduction so you know what we're actually talking about. We will then show what member states have actually done across the EU, so how 28 countries have responded to the legal text of Article 7 and what their plans are. We will then put a more critical spotlight on the plans of member states and evaluate to what extent the Article 7 in the Energy Efficiency Directive is likely to achieve what it set out to do, and also propose some areas where some amendments could be made. We will then put a spotlight on the energy efficiency obligations, and that's when Tina Fawcett, my colleague, will take over, and she will talk about the different schemes in Europe and the challenges going forward in that area. Then we draw some conclusions, and as I said before, you will have some slides on further readings as well. So let me start by setting the scene and outlining what Article 7 actually does. So there are 4 main elements of Article 7, if you like, and I go through each element one by one. I'm not sure why it doesn't appear on this slide. Sorry, this was here before. It's gone now. Okay, I do this verbally. So the first element of Article 7 is a target of 1.5% of final energy sales. So this is a target that has been set by the Commission for every member state that needs to be achieved, and the target can be lowered by taking into account a number of exclusions and exemptions. And the actual effect of this is that the actual target across the European Union is about 0.75% on average for each member state, and that's our final energy consumption. Then the next element is that member states have a choice between energy efficiency obligation schemes or alternative policy measures. So they have to design plans where they can show how they, now we can actually see the elements on the screen, which is great. So the second element I was talking about is this choice between obligation schemes and alternative measures. And it's up to member states how they design their policy packages. So they could say, we just do energy efficiency obligations, or we use alternative measures. For example, we use loans or grant schemes, regulations, or we use a combination of alternative measures and energy efficiency obligations. The third element is that there are very detailed provisions around the calculation methods. So once you have your policy instruments in place and your target, you need to show how you've actually calculated the energy savings from the various policy measures. And there are very detailed requirements around additionality, materiality, double counting, etc. We're not going through those within this presentation. We will touch on some of those elements, but they're really detailed and quite complex requirements on how this has to be done. And the last and final element in the article are requirements around monitoring and verification. And those include, for example, the need to monitor a statistically representative sample, to have audit protocols in place, and to have an independence of the monitoring and auditing authority. This is all set out in the Annex 5 and in Article 7 in the legal text. So those are the four main elements if you break it down. There's much more to Article 7, but I think these are the four key elements that I wanted to point out that you should remember. And I will now talk about what's coming up in the coming months, because there will be some changes to Article 7, and we expect a major review of the article to be published in early October 2016. So the European Commission is currently working on revising the legal text. And there might be changes. There most likely will be some changes. At the same time, the Energy Performance in Buildings Directive, the EPBD, will be reviewed. That drives building codes in Europe, for those of you who are not familiar with European policy. So two major changes in policy could happen when we move into the autumn of this year. And the work that we're presenting here is based on what happened so far and feeds into the review that the Commission is undertaking, given that the study that I talked about before was commissioned by the European Commission, and the European Parliament have asked for a similar study as well. And this also feeds into the policy process. So how have Member States actually responded to the legal requirements around Article 7? And I will show you a few slides that summarize the key responses. But before I do that, I just wanted to point out the sheer task of going through all the material that has been submitted to the Commission, 7,000 pages of plans from all the Member States that had to be analyzed. And I was in the very fortunate position to be leading that exercise, which was at times quite painful. But in the end, we analyzed almost 500 policy instruments, some of them with very detailed explanations of how they have been planned and designed and the savings have been calculated, and others with less detail. So that's the kind of effort that was involved in getting to the bottom of what Member States have actually done. I now want to show you the key headline results of that exercise. So the number of policy instruments by policy instrument type across the EU. Remember, almost 500 instruments in total. You see a share here of the different types of instruments. And the main instrument that's going to be used in terms of numbers will be financial incentives. And that's a range of instruments like grants and loans, tax rebates. The energy efficiency obligation schemes, which were featuring very prominently in Article 7, which I mentioned before, only will only have 4% share in the number of policy measures. But when you actually look at the share of the expected savings, not the number of measures, but how many savings will be delivered, you can see that the obligation schemes in the blue color here, light blue color here, will deliver or expected to deliver more than a third of all the savings. So remember, less than 4% of the total number of policy instruments delivers 34% of the overall savings. Other important instruments are fiscal instruments, as you would have expected, given that they had the highest share in terms of the number, but only 19% compared to 38% of the total number of policy instruments. So you can see already that there's the picture emerging with some measures being more important than others. I now want to show you how this plays out in the different sectors. So we have analyzed all the instruments, looked at which sectors they're targeting, and you can see that about 42% of the savings will be derived from the building sector, only 8% in industry and 6% in transport. And the cross-cutting category is in here and is quite large because often policy instruments target a range of sectors, and it's not always clear what the proportional share of those sectors is when you look at a policy instrument. So to give you an example, if you have a taxation instrument that taxes energy across all sectors, it's more difficult to attribute the savings to the different sectors. Or an energy efficiency obligation scheme that promotes energy efficiency improvements across different sectors. Some member states actually provide figures that break down the savings by sector, but many don't. And that's why we end up with quite a large, chunky category of cross-cutting. If you apply the same share to cross-cutting between industry, transport, and buildings that we have on this pie chart, you would get to a figure of up to 75% of savings coming from the building sector. It could be less than that, it could be more, we just don't know, but it will be the highest share of the savings is most likely to come from buildings, which doesn't come as a surprise for energy efficiency experts. As we know, in buildings there's a vast potential of energy savings, particularly in the European Union member states. So these are the sort of descriptive high-level results of those studies. We now move on into the next section, which is giving you a more critical evaluation of how much of this is actually likely going to happen, what are the key issues around the plans that member states put forward. Because remember, all of this is currently on paper. It's expected savings that will be delivered between 2014 and 2020. It's not the actual savings that have happened, and we have to bear that in mind. So the critical evaluation of this is really important to understand where the key issues are. And the first graph I wanted to show you is just to compare the impact assessment estimates of how much energy would be saved with the expected savings targets and the policy measures put in place. And you can see that in 2011, the impact assessment of Article 7 had a much higher estimate of how many units of energy would be saved. The main reason for this was that before the text was going through Parliament of the Energy Efficiency Directive, a lot of the exemptions that are now in the directive have not been in there. So the actual requirements for energy savings targets are lower, and this is mainly a result of the parliamentary process. So you can see that the second bar, the negotiated Energy Efficiency Directive text, already had a much lower estimate of how much would be delivered, mainly a result of the exemptions. And then we have two bars which are actually based on the plans that member states put forward. So the third bar from the left, the energy saving targets, those are the targets that member states have notified to the European Commission. And you can see that the targets are close to what was estimated how much the negotiated final Energy Efficiency Directive would deliver. There's a gap there, and that gap is mainly there because those member states that have delivered their targets to the European Commission have used slightly different baselines than what was anticipated when the initial estimate was made. To give you one example, most member states would use Eurostat data, which is a common database of energy consumption across Europe, for those of you who are not familiar with it. But some member states have opted to use national statistics, and their data sets are somewhat different to the data sets that the Eurostat has produced. That's the main reason for the discrepancy. And when you look at the last bar, the policy measures bar, you can see that overall member states are likely to achieve or planning to achieve their targets. And this is a mixture. Some member states will just about hit their target as planned. Some member states plan to over-deliver significantly. Denmark would be one example. Denmark has a much higher amount of savings than the target that is required of them. So that's the overall picture in terms of what is planned by member states and how it compares to previous estimates. The question is, how credible is all this? So we could say, well, it's on paper, it will probably happen, but we all know that it's really difficult to estimate ex ante how many savings will be delivered by different policies. There are uncertainties around this. So some of this analysis looked at the credibility of the savings. And this is rather complex, so let me talk you through this step by step. So we looked at 4 different criteria for assessing the credibility of the planned energy savings. The first one is additionality, which is used in a slightly different way in the Energy Efficiency Directive. I know that in the US it's mainly referring to free riders, and in the European Union additionality is often used as additionality in contrast to existing policies. So is it additional to any other European policies? For example, there already are minimum levels of taxation for energy, so you have to go beyond in order to achieve additional savings with taxation measures. So for additionality, we looked at all the different policy measures that have been planned and assessed to what extent they were likely to be additional to what was already required prior to the implementation of the Energy Efficiency Directive. And you can see that quite a large share of those savings, about 60%, are not fully compliant, and are likely not to be fully compliant. And I say this because often we just have the documented energy savings and a statement around additionality, which may or may be very, very detailed or not very detailed. And there are risks around how, to what extent the additionality is going to be guaranteed by the different policy instruments. And that's what the assessment results in. So we can see quite a high share of the savings are at least at risk of not being fully additional. And the second one is the risk of non-delivery. And this includes things like materiality. So for example, if you have a fiscal instrument that makes a very low contribution to the overall investment cost, there's a risk that the savings won't materialize because the beneficiaries don't respond to an incentive, which is, let's say, just 1% of the total investment cost. That's the second category here. And then the third one is relatively simple. That's around the eligibility of the different technologies. So some member states have put forward renewable energy technologies as measures to save energy, and there are clear statements in the guidance around the directive that says that only technologies which deliver end-use savings can be included. And if it's just converting energy with a different fuel type, then it can't be included in the Energy Efficiency Directive Article 7. That's what eligibility is around. And the risk of double counting, the last bar, is about having multiple policies. And I said before, you could have a mixture. You could have alternative measures, obligation schemes, and you have to make sure that there's no overlap between those different instruments, or if there is, that you have factored that in when you make the calculations. And you see that actually the problem is relatively small compared to the other categories. About 20% are at some risk of double counting, but for 80% of the savings, that doesn't seem to be an issue. So that's a high-level assessment of how credible the savings actually are. And we have also done a calculation to say, okay, actually, what is the share of all of the savings that is actually fully compliant on all four criteria? Fully additional, no risk of non-delivery, fully eligible, and no risk of double counting. And only 14% of the savings tick all those boxes. This doesn't mean that only 14% will be delivered. It just means that 96% of the savings are at some risk of not being fully compliant with the directive. We don't know exactly what the proportion is. It's impossible to find that out at this stage because we only have the ex-ante estimates and often not enough detail. But this is just to give you a flavor of the scale of the challenge. So how do we address this issue of credibility? I just want to put a few suggestions forward for policy reform to address those. So the first one is on the question of additionality. So currently, it's very difficult to calculate and prove additionality, and particularly with regard to the Energy Performance in Buildings Directive. It's not an easy task, and many member states have struggled with that. So one potential solution will be to simplify the rules around those calculation requirements, and, for example, allow all the renovations of buildings to count fully, but to exclude all the savings from new buildings, because we can assume that many of those savings would happen anyway under the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive. This is one example of how a potential solution could look like. The second suggestion is around monitoring and verification, which is something that I know in the US is very advanced, where on average 3% of the program costs are allocated to monitoring and verification. In Europe, we're a bit behind, and some countries are doing better than others, but overall we're a bit behind. It's probably fair to say. So there needs to be more guidance, in our view, and an improved Annex 5 of the directive, which sets out very clearly what is required, and possibly develop some high-level principles at EU level that would say, this is the gold standard of monitoring verification, this is what you need to do, without having to aim for full harmonization, which is probably something that is very difficult to achieve with 28 member states, but to set out some of the main leading principles, and those could be based on existing protocols for monitoring, verifying energy savings. And the last point here I would like to make is on reporting. I mentioned the 7,000 pages of documents that we had to review and how painful this was at times. And part of the pain was coming from the fact that all those documents look different. So you have one country that submits 300 pages of documents and another that submits just 4. And the format is different and the structure is completely different, and it's very hard to identify the key features that you want to analyze. So for the European Commission, in order to be able to actually scrutinize those plans in a more straightforward way, and for member states to be able to actually report more efficiently and effectively, having a clear reporting template that just explains what you have to report in what format, that would be, I think, a very, very good suggestion for a way forward. I will now hand over to Tina to talk about energy efficiency obligation schemes in more detail. And the reason why we selected this particular instrument is that, first of all, it was always the most prominent instrument in the directive. Article 7, before it went to Parliament, actually had only obligation schemes in there for Article 7 requirement, for all 28 member states to have obligation schemes, and they're delivering a very large share of energy savings. Not the lion's share, but they deliver the largest share of any other compared to any other instrument. So Tina, I hand over to you, and I will keep quiet for now.
Okay, so as Jan has explained, this energy efficiency obligations are the single most important instrument. I'm assuming that most of you have an idea of what they are. I mean, a general description would be that they're a regulatory mechanism that requires obligated parties to meet quantitative energy savings targets through delivering energy efficiency to end users. So it's not about making the transmission of electricity, say, more efficient. It's about energy efficiency at end users, whether that's householders or businesses or industrial sector or transport operators. The unique features of an energy efficiency obligation are its method of raising funding. So the money in some form comes from energy customers. And there's also the fact that these funds are collected by the energy distributors or the retailers, depending who the obligated party is operating the scheme. So it's not a scheme that's funded out of general taxation. And in some ways, its role could be replaced with other subsidy schemes funded by the taxpayer. So a lot of the things that are done through energy efficiency obligation schemes could equally well be paid for out of central government funds, but they're not. So it's not unique in the sorts of things it can do. It's the financing mechanism, and it's who the obligation is put on. That's the unique thing. So what do we know about EEOs? I'm just going to quickly go through a few things that we have learned through sort of worldwide experience. I'm mostly focusing here on the European experience, but there's also some data here that's come from external to the EU. So we know there's more than 50 of these schemes in the world. About half of them are in the US, which are in place on regulated utilities, which is quite a different system from what we have in the EU. And in the EU, they're placed on a mixture of either retail or distribution companies, or in some cases actually both. What we can see from looking at all these different schemes is they're all different, and there are no two the same anywhere in the world. At the moment, Luxembourg is saying it's going to copy the Danish scheme for their energy efficiency obligation, but I'd be surprised if it ends up exactly the same, because it's a very adaptable policy, and each country tends to fit it to national circumstances. And along with that, we know that lots of different designs can be successful. So we can't say it's always better to put it on a retail company or a distribution company. Either can work if you do it correctly. These EEOs have delivered large improvements in energy efficiency. Where they've worked well, they've delivered a considerable fraction of energy efficiency improvement, up to about 1% per annum of delivered energy. They've also been very cost effective, and we're not presenting it here, but there is some quite good data showing just how cheap they are compared with the cost of energy supply. We know that having standardised actions and deemed savings can be very effective. which is, once it's set up, is a nice simple thing to operate, although it needs constant revision, of course, as technologies change. We know that most savings, particularly in Europe, but I think also beyond, have come from relatively low-cost energy measures in the building sector. And it's not universally true. So in Italy and Denmark, they focused much more on the industrial sector. Impacts on ESCO developments have been mixed. So at the start, to say, for example, in the UK, there was quite a lot of hope that somehow by having this obligation on the energy retail companies, it would change their business model and change them into energy service companies. Now, that hasn't happened at all, but in some other countries like Italy, there has been an increase in the ESCO sector. So it's, again, that's about scheme design and national circumstance. And finally, we know if you focus on low-income groups in the residential sector, you can spread the benefits of the scheme more widely. So I'd just now like to talk, I've already said that all the schemes are different, so I'd just like to pick out a few key things that vary across EEOs, either planned or existing in the EU. At the moment, we've got 16 planned and existing energy obligation schemes. They're all different. They differ with respect to the number and type of obligated parties, the fuels covered, the eligible sectors, the projects, the monitoring, the funding, and the metrics, whether you're thinking about carbon or first-year energy savings or total energy savings across a lifetime. So they're all different. So the obligated parties, this is one of the key differences. So it can be distribution companies rather than retailers, although most of the European ones are on energy retailers. Some countries have included heating oil suppliers and district heating companies, so again, Denmark is including those. Some countries have included transport fuel suppliers, for example, France. And so then the number of obligated parties can be anything from less than 10, so in the UK I think at the moment it's 7, up to thousands. So there's a huge variety of complexity of schemes and numbers of organisations involved. In terms of sectors, most schemes cover all sectors, and only the UK and Malta restricts theirs to the residential sector. And this is just this sort of summarises what I've been saying, the next slide, and shows you in which countries, I'm not going to go through this now, but it just shows you in which countries have chosen to go for supplier obligations, which have chosen distributors, and then there's a couple of countries that are planning an obligation on both. And then the next one also shows sectors. So again, as I was saying, most schemes look at all sectors, but there's two and one big one, which is the UK, which is only focused on the residential sector. So that's one set of variations. The next set of variations are about distribution of benefits and trading and relevant parties. Again, I'm not going to say much in detail about this, just to point out that particularly when you're thinking about the residential sector, how you can design your scheme to make special allowance for low income or households who are in fuel poverty or energy poverty, as it's sometimes called. In the UK, there's been a strong tradition of using this policy for social purposes as well as for environmental purposes. So there's always been a focus on ensuring that lower income and vulnerable households get a lot of the benefits of the scheme. It's becoming increasingly important in France, and across Europe there's more of a conversation about energy and fuel poverty, so we may see this becoming more important. And one of the questions about revisions to Article 7 asked people whether they thought it should be a mandatory part of this scheme. I mean, I suspect it won't be, but that was to show you that at a European level people are thinking about this more perhaps than they used to. The final thing I'd mention in terms of variation is the degree of trading. Some schemes have what they call white certificates, so they can trade the savings between, well, a variety of actors. In some schemes, different parties are able to get involved. In some schemes like the UK don't have a formal trading system, nevertheless there is a sort of market there is a degree of trading between different parties who are involved. So yes, it's quite complicated what different countries have tried to do, and possibly there's less difference between those with trading without than you might at first think, because there's usually some flexibility mechanisms that enable you to get some of the benefits of trading even if you don't have a totally traded system. So that's another thing that changes within Europe. So I'm just now going to talk about the challenges. First of all, the challenges for new energy efficiency obligation schemes. So there were sort of 5 schemes that have a reasonable history in the EU. There's about 5 new ones that have started, another 5 or 6 that have yet to get going. And this is really about the credibility of savings and what do we expect can happen by 2020. We know a lot of the new energy efficiency obligation schemes are planning to deliver savings. I'll show a table in a minute, sometimes quite a significant proportion of their total national requirement in a really short time. And this really goes against our experience of what makes us an EEO successful and what enables it to deliver savings. So if we look at this example, then the numbers don't really matter here. I think just look at the timescales across the bottom. This is the UK scheme, which is one of the 2 oldest in Europe. And if you look at the sort of the 4th bar along, that's when the UK started getting a bit serious in terms of what it wanted to deliver. The UK scheme is set in terms of carbon rather than energy, but if you just look at how it's ramped up over time, you can see that sort of 10 years from the start of the 4th bar to the end of the 6th one. And it took that time scale to be able to ramp up and for the companies involved to be able to deliver this scale of savings. And so when we see new schemes that say, well, we're going to go from 0 to 100, very large amount of savings within 5 years, I think, we need to be sort of somewhat challenging about that. The learning period could be shortened, perhaps by either learning from other countries or for having a voluntary scheme. And if we look at the table, that one, these are the new and planned schemes within Europe. And just to reiterate what I've said, the 3 white ones, Austria, Ireland and Luxembourg, they've either had a voluntary scheme before their mandatory scheme or they're copying another country, so they might shorten the learning period. The others aren't. And if you look, for example, at Bulgaria, they say they're going to deliver 100% of their Article 7 savings through this scheme that's supposedly starting in 2014. So countries are giving themselves an awful lot to do. And while we can't say that there's a design of EEO that will necessarily work better than another, what we can say is all the ones in Europe that have delivered relatively high amounts of savings have taken a few years to get going, to learn, to allow all the participants to learn how to do it and to redesign the scheme as necessary to make it, efficient and effective. So this is a kind of a detailed bit of concern around what might be delivered. Okay. And finally on EEOs, I'll just say something about challenges for all of them. And this is, particularly this first bullet point, would be really interested to hear what you've got to say about this. We're proposing that there is a challenge for these schemes going forward because some of the low-cost opportunities, particularly in the residential sector, are not there anymore. Some of the lighting, some of the cheap insulation measures have already been done in quite a lot of the housing stock. So can these schemes, which gather a bit of money from all customers, distribute it evenly by giving a bit of benefit to all customers, or are those days over? Or maybe we're wrong. Maybe there are always new low-cost opportunities. So it'd be interesting to hear your views on that. Jan talked about additionality. I mean, not to labour this point, but just that as European policy covers more and more types of efficiency issues through product policy particularly, but also the energy performance in building directives, there's not that much policy space left for EEOs to do anything. It's largely in renovation of existing buildings at the moment. And a lot of the calls around that are for deep renovation, so fundamental renovation of the building fabric. And it's hard to see how this policy mechanism could really deliver that because the sums involved where it is done in that way are really quite large. And it's not the way EEOs have worked in the past. You might do more on industry and transport, and there might be more opportunities there. Certainly some countries have found those. And finally, I would say a challenge for EEOs, perhaps I'm sensitive about this being from the UK, but is that often they're not understood by the populations or the companies who benefit from them. And so then if there is a challenge to them in terms of they're putting too much cost on our energy bills, there may not be any political support to retain them. And we had that experience recently in the UK where our rather successful scheme has become a lot smaller than it used to be in terms of ambition because of lack of public and political support for its continuance, despite the evidence of it being extremely good value for money. So, if these schemes want to just do good by not being noticed, that may sort of be a problem for them in the long run when they need that support. Okay, we're going to move on to conclusions now.
And we split those in half. So I'm drawing some general conclusions on Article 7, and Tina will speak specifically about obligation schemes. So the first one is an obvious one, that Article 7 is a very complex and ambitious piece of legislation, and therefore policy evaluation is very challenging. But also because of the the diversity in policies that we've seen and the sheer amount of documentation. I mentioned 7,000 pages, and we're almost 500 policy instruments. So it makes it very difficult to evaluate ex ante, but also ex post, and to make sure that we can track how much is being delivered. The member states should be on course to deliver savings close to what was anticipated if we call them paper savings materialize in real life. But the main challenge will be to make sure that what is on paper actually happens in reality, and to develop a mechanism that gives us the confidence that those savings actually materialize. The current legal framework is robust and is good, but it has some areas where it can be improved, and it has led to some unintended interpretations that in turn resulted in lower savings from the directive. And there are a lot of uncertainties around the reliability of the energy savings estimates put forward by member states, particular concerns around additionality and the risk of non-delivery are the main concerns, and monitoring verification will be key to address those points. And on EEOs, Tina will briefly summarize.
So just briefly, as we know, EEOs provide more savings than any other policy instrument. They vary a lot in scope and scale and design. Most of the EEOs in the EU now are new schemes, and these new and planned schemes, a lot of them are probably overly optimistic in about how quickly substantial savings can be delivered. And so, in conclusion, a lot of work needs to be done to make the new EEOs a success by making sure they learn lessons from established schemes. And that's one of the things this project I'm involved with, ENSPOL, has been about doing, but more of that work needs to be done. And finally, our sort of overall headline, our question of our seminar was, can Europe deliver on energy efficiency? And I think in theory, yes, it can. But as you've heard, we've got doubts about these anticipated Article 7 savings actually being delivered unless we rectify these problems. And we've got an opportunity to do that with the legislation being revised, but clearly that needs to happen. As we mentioned briefly at the start, although Europe's likely to meet its current 2020 savings target, these are a lot less ambitious than the sort of targets we're looking at for 2030 and beyond if we're going to help reduce greenhouse gas emissions to stay within the 2 degrees C envelope, let alone if we think about the 1.5 degrees C ambition that was raised at Paris. So I think we need more ambition, we need better estimation of savings, monitoring and evaluation, and of course delivery. And our final, perhaps fairly obvious point is that clearly knowledge exchange and learning between member states would really help deliver energy efficiency.
And I think that's it. We only have other slides for you to look at after the presentation with further readings and some information about ENSPOL and RAP, and that's it. And we'd be happy to take any questions. And I think we hand it over to the moderator now to receive questions from you.